Welcome to our talk, Empowering Your Sound Designer, a live Unity 3D and Wwise demonstration. So my name is Ramy.
I'm Beatrix.
And we're both working on a game right now called Anamorphine. And it has no active mechanics, no UI, and no voiceover. So it's all about story, environments, and audio. And knowing that, we looked at typical development processes for game development studio. And usually you have like these three big disciplines: art, programming, and audio. And usually it looks something like this, where art and programming are really tightly coupled, integrating constantly together. And when the project is done or almost done, we look back and we say, we have all these noisemakers. Could you make an asset list and talk to the programmer about how to integrate it? And then the programmer takes a turn integrating it. Sometimes there's some mistakes, so there's some back and forth, basically putting a middleman between the audio designer and their implementation. So instead, for this project, what we wanted to do is integrate the audio design into the development process, just like we would any other discipline in the production. What this means in practice is that art, programming, and audio all work in the engine together at the same time.
This is really useful for creative process as well. I mean, not only is it efficient because I'm not constantly having to describe what I want sonically to a programmer who maybe doesn't specialize in that, but it's also really useful in my design process because I can come up with an idea, I can create some prototyping in my DAW, I can throw that into Wwise, I can implement that in Unity, I can try it with the gameplay, see how it feels in the mix, see how it feels in the context of the story, and then I can iterate on that, and that's all part of my initial design process. So it allows me to really understand how my sound is going to work in the game, and it also makes my creative process much more, it has a flow, right? It's much easier to come up with new ideas and also to create more complex systems without having to wait potentially several days for something to go into the game.
Yeah, and just the fact that everybody's now working in the game engine together really helps the communication within the team. Everybody's talking about the same thing. Everybody's context is the same when it comes to finishing a project together. Before I keep going and I start talking about tooling, I'm wondering if we have any programmers in the crowd. Oh, that's really cool. Excellent. So, and I guess audio designers? Excellent. All right. So almost 50-50. Yeah, that's really good. So some of the tooling we'll be going over. There's not a lot, but they are quite intense. So the first one is one of them is going to be the event system. So this is a system that will allow us to communicate across scenes. So if each discipline has their own scenes that they work in within like a chapter or like a sequence within a game, we still need a way for code to talk to audio, or for audio to talk to art, and for things to kind of synchronize together. So an event system is what's going to help us achieve that. And then the other big thing is we're going to talk about the general audio utility that we have, and how we use it to leverage like basic functionality and more specific like game or project specific functionality within the engine. So we're using Unity and Wwise, but the things we're talking about today, or like the process we want to like highlight, is the integration of an audio designer into a team. So although we're using these engines, what we're talking about isn't limited to these engines. All right, so let's jump in.
Okay, so I just want to demonstrate a little bit how the audio box works. That's what we call it. From a most basic level, of course, triggering events in game is rather useful. So this is what the audio box looks like on a most basic level. I can choose to have a number of different sound mods here and have independent control over each of them. And so for starters, what I have here is I have an AK ambient empty event. So right here in the game object, I have an AK ambient. I'm gonna use mouse. And there's nothing in it. It's just an empty event. There's no sound attached to this. And this just lets me set up this game object to receive sound. So what I'm doing here is I have a drop-down list that has all of the events in the game listed in it. Do you want to talk about the ID banks, sound banks
Oh, yeah.
builder?
Sure. Yeah, so one of the things that we noticed by having an audio designer integrated into the team is that everybody kind of also had to be synchronized with having audio as part of that workflow. So we created a few like small scripts to help us out. So when Beatrix comes up with like some new sound banks, some new Wwise IDs are generated, and here they are. And we have some small utilities to help us just generate those IDs. So this script goes into one of the Wwise provided Python scripts that helps us generate, translate the .h file with all the events into a .cs file, which lets us read it and populate lists like this that make it easy to integrate for the audio box.
Yeah, so then what I can do is I can select that event here, and when this audio box triggers right now just on start, which is the default condition, it'll send that event to this AK ambient. And that is quite interesting because it means that I can have just an empty prototype, or I guess you could say a dummy ambient, and then I can send different kinds of sounds to that according to gameplay. Something else I can do is, on a more basic level, I can just trigger an event that lives on an AK ambient. So I have here, for example, a looping bird sound or a bike, and then this box is just going to pull the sound from that AK ambient and trigger it. And that's what this checkbox here does. You'll notice that it grays out the drop-down. Now this is unimportant. It's not looking at that. It's just going to pull whatever's on that AK ambient and trigger it. This is also interesting because as I can also add sound mods, I can also just change the number of game objects that are referenced within a single sound mod. And I can reference more than one different AK ambient here. Regardless of what's on there, I can trigger a number of AK ambients with a single sound mod. And that's really useful for things like, I use this a lot in Anamorphine for triggering environmental sounds. So when we move into a new space, I'll have all of the environmental sounds set up in a list in a sound mod. And as we enter that space, they all begin to play. So that leads me actually to the next setup, which is a new condition. Now we have on trigger enter. I can also select on trigger exit. And so now we just have, can we see that trigger? Yeah. So now walking into this trigger will trigger this AK ambient bird sound, and then it will trigger the bike sound with a 2-second delay. And that delay actually becomes really useful as well a lot of the time. So obviously this is really basic stuff. Where it gets really interesting is when we start manipulating RTPCs, real-time parameter changes. This is super useful. I use this a ton. So on a most basic level, I have here a couple of trigger boxes, A and B, and they're controlling either a state or a switch. We'll talk about states first because they're global, so they're very straightforward. So I have here an ambience, and when I hit play, we won't hear anything because it's set to default none. And then when I walk into one of these boxes, we'll start to hear that ambience. And we can just change it dynamically according to player position. So that allows me to do a lot of switching of space and mood, and also I can use states, of course, to control mixing in the game. I can also use this for switches. So switches can be, or are local. So there I'm using now the same reference object here to tell the switch what I want controlled by that switch. So now if I hit play, we're going to hear some cello. And then I can switch that over to violin with the switch. Just very straightforward stuff. And now what we have over here is, actually I'm going to stay in play mode to demonstrate this. I have over here a sphere collider. And the sphere collider is really interesting because it's controlling a parameter. And that parameter, it doesn't have any kind of lerping or slew rate set up in Wwise. It's based entirely on player position relative to the radial center of the circle. And I can also do that with this. This is a very similar structure. This is a distance slider. So it's a matter of the parameter is basically laid out over these 2 points right here. difference here is that when we exit that distance slider, it will keep the parameter value that it was at the point of exit. So I use this a lot for in-game mixing. You can also use it for funner things. For example, playback speed of music and such things gets really interesting, where the player's position in space is really controlling the way that the sound plays in a very live feedback kind of way. I also have an add function. I won't demo that live right now, but add is, well, let's start with toggle actually. So toggle lets me trigger a parameter value. This is not on a slide. This is just a hard toggle. So if I want to change the parameter value, I just set a target value here. And if I want that to move gradually, then I'll have to set up a slew rate within Wwise. And then we also have this other option, add. This is basically like the relative version of the absolute, that is toggle, because what it'll do is it'll just add or subtract a value from whatever the current value of that parameter is. So that's about it for manipulating RTPCs. And then the third tool we have, and this is a really interesting one, because as far as I know, you can't do this with any of the onboard Wwise tools. And it's really, really useful. We set this up because in our game, there's a lot of transitions that are happening, and those transitions are intended to feel seamless and such be a sort of a surprise for the player. And so when you're moving out of a space position, if you have positional audio, you're going to hear that, right? You're going to hear that sound cut out suddenly, and it just kills that effect completely. So there's 4 components to the attach that I have, and they are attached to player, move toward player, attach to object, so there I can populate this with an object, and move toward that object. So what this allows me to do is I can attach an object, such as the cello sound, to the player, have it move toward the player so it carries along with the player when we transition the player to a new scene, and then I can offload that sound onto a game object in the scene. Sometimes it's as simple as using the audio box itself just to remove that object from the player after the transition has happened, and then I can naturally fade out that sound and we won't hear that hard cut even if it's a positional sound. Let's look at that in practice.
Is there no audio?
Why is there no audio?
Oh, do we have to delay?
No?
Delay enable?
No. I don't know why we're not hearing that cello. I'm just going to use a different sound. Okay. Okay, so here I've got a 3D positional sound. When I walk into the trigger, it'll come to the player. Now it's attached to me, and then when I exit, it'll move on to that place that I told it to go to. And I have here some extra controls. I have speed value. I find 3 to 5 gives like a really sort of even sound, so you don't notice it necessarily coming and going, especially if you're moving around. And I also have the option to offset that sound from the player if I choose to. So really basic sort of gray box demos of what the audio box can do. I think it's much more interesting to start showing these systems in a practical scenario. And also, I'm going to let Ramy demonstrate the event tag system now.
All right, so when we talk about having the entire team develop scenes on their own, we still need some common scenes in between them that everybody kind of needs to test their what they're working on. So one of those is a master. So the master has what we call a bootstrap, which just loads some high-level, like a high-level singleton with some high-level tools for the entire game. Stuff like game input, a level manager, config. We also have here a Wwise initializer, which creates the Wwise object, the AK initializer for us, and it allows us to populate it with some various parameters. And of course, has the event manager that we're going to be talking about. It has the player. And anytime anybody's working on something, we need these things. So if I just press play, it creates this special toolbox, and inside we have this level manager, Wwise initializer, and this event manager, which doesn't have any interface to it, but we'll be talking about how that works too. So if we have an art scene, we just drag it in. There we go. Let's go there. So here we have clearly an art scene developed by an artist, and there's no code in here. And I think if I play, there should be an animation. So here I am, and we see this tarp kind of flopping around in the wind. And what we're going to do is we're going to hook this up so that it has registrations into the event manager to hook it up on an audio side. So the event manager works with two different kinds of components. It works with simple events, what we call simple events, and actions. And its job is to grab a simple event and match it to an action and hook them up. And once that hookup is done, it doesn't care about them anymore. It doesn't manage them. It's not like a lifelong process. Its only job is to pair things up together, and once that's done, it releases them. That makes the event manager a really small piece of code. I think if I showed it here, we use a dictionary to store all that stuff, but you could easily use a queue, you could use an array. It's really pretty simple stuff. We just iterate through the array. Like I'm not going to go through the code itself. It's pretty boring, but we just go through the array and we just match it with tags. The tags, we have a small interface for those. They look like this. Whoa. Sorry, 1 second. Okay. All right. So here we already have some tags built in. And we threw this up really quickly. We have 3 categories, like 3 groups, a group, subgroup, and an actual node. And we're going to be using this tarp tag. So the tag doesn't do anything special. It's just a string that everybody can agree on. And you attach this tag to an event, and you attach that same tag to an action, and the event manager sees that there's an action and an event with the same tag, matches them together, and then lets them go. What the event manager can also do is do many-to-many or single-to-one relationship, single-to-many or many-to-a-single relationship. So you can have one action be tied to many events. You can have one event be tied to many actions because it uses a C# event, which you can just put functions in as you want. So for this tarp, we're going to build the event registration and all that.
And this is normally something the artist would do as part of their process.
Yeah, so you'll notice that I'm only going to be working on the art scene here and nothing else. And then I'm going to bring it over to Beatrix, and she's going to work on it in the audio scene, and then we're going to play it all together, and we're going to see how it all hooks up. So we have this tarp asset with the animation. So I'm just going to go through this animator quickly. It has one animation state with a tarp wind. And if I look at that, we see that it has an animation event inside the animation curves. And it's just executing this generic function that we have. And we're going to put this function in by adding a component here. Animation, animation event register, that's it. So this is a really simple piece of script. It just has 3 simple events and 3 simple functions that the animation calls. So we're going to be calling this one. And when this function is called, it'll execute the event here. This simple event looks really simple. Yeah, it's simple for a reason. It has a simple signature. So the only thing we send is a transform. And that covers 99% of our use cases. We generally don't need to send anything else. With a transform, you can kind of work your way back into an object and get whatever components you need from there. Nothing too fancy, just an execute function to make it all work, which is the convention that we all agreed on would be used here. So we're calling that execute function, sending this transform. Even if we don't use it, we just send it in anyway. All right, so we have this animation event register, but we don't have a tag tied to it yet. So we're going to create, well, we're going to add an event registrar. And what I do is I feed it the component that is going to have those events. And here I can pick which event I want and which tag I'm going to tie it to. So I have this like drop-down list here, and I can just source it out. And the last thing I need to synchronize the animation properly, we disable the animator for the start of it. I'm just going to, I guess I can just, create a new one here.
So we create a slight delay in the animation because this animation loop starts on the scene load, and what we found is that sometimes it starts just a little too fast and the sound bank hasn't completely loaded yet, so we have to wait for the next animation loop for the sound to start triggering. So just by giving it a 1 second delay, we make sure that the sound is playing from the very beginning of the scene.
I don't need this. I don't need this. I'll put a game object enabler. Like that. Get my tarp. Yeah. Do this on start. We'll put a 1.5 second delay. Oh, actually, we'll do it on trigger enter. We don't destroy itself. And that should be good. Oh yeah, one last thing. Oh, it's a good idea. So, so this trigger can only be triggered by the player. Once they enter, we'll have a 1.5 second delay, and then we'll activate this animator component. And I think that's all I need to do on my end. So I'm going to save this, and then I'm going to let Beatrix work on it.
Cool. So as Ramy mentioned, I never have to touch the art scenes. I can just grab those event tags in my audio scene. So I have this audio box here specifically for the tarp. Are you locked? Yes.
Oh yeah, sorry, I'm locked.
Okay, so here I have 4 different AK ambients triggering specifically for that animation, just for spatial reasons. And so they're all being triggered using that event tag that Ramy set up. So basically on my condition, instead of start or trigger enter, I'm going to on event, and then I can grab that same event tag, and then when it triggers in the art scene, it will automatically trigger my sound in sync, and there is no noticeable delay in this at all. It's really great for syncing up animations in a way where I'm not constantly having to work in the art scene or set up my own triggers. Should we try it out?
Yeah.
These are all the scenes we need loaded, right?
Yeah, I think so.
All right. So it's a little bit quiet, but you can see there that we have some really nice Foley sync on animation now. Cool.
Yeah, so that's when we're in development. This is the setup we would use. When the actual game gets like built and packaged, what we have is another scene entirely that'll assemble all of this together for us. So we have this loader. And this loader also contains a bootstrap. Bootstraps make sure that there isn't like another singleton already in existence, doesn't duplicate it, and it has this loader, which, here they are, and we just tell it to load all the scenes that we need. So when I press play, you'll see it'll assemble the entire sequence for us.
Just get everything set up for that. Yeah, so now we can see all of the various audio box components that I showed you in the first part of the talk kind of working together to create a seamless transition in this space.
Do we want to generate the Wwise IDs?
Yeah, let's do that too. I don't always have to generate the Wwise IDs. Actually, let's talk about the difference between these two. So
Yeah,
the
sure.
build sound bank script, it's building every single sound bank that exists in the game, so long as they do have to be selected in Wwise. Once they've been selected in Wwise, then all of those sound banks will build. But if the sound banks aren't selected, then that doesn't work properly. So that is one thing that is the case.
Yeah.
We do need to have Wwise installed on everybody's machine. The build sound banks IDs only. This is really, really useful because as I'm building new events or parameters or switches and I want those populated in the audio box, I don't want to build everything again. This doesn't look at what's already built. It starts from scratch. So that can take some time in bigger projects. So after that initial build, I'm only using this one. And it just grabs those Wwise IDs. And after that, everything I need is populated in the audio box drop-down lists.
Yeah, Beatrix usually uses that one, and me and the artist, we usually use the top one that builds the entire sound banks in one shot, because then I don't have to open Wwise. I can just double-click on that, and it'll execute Wwise to the command line, generate all the sound banks, and then do the C# file for us as well. Yeah, so we're ready now for the loader. So if I press play, we'll see the loader assemble all the scenes for us and spawn us in the correct place. So here we go, art scene, audio, code, master. And we're in.
So we just triggered load, so we're loading the next art scene. We've got this cello playing. And now we're in the next scene. So I set up that transition using a number of the tools that I demonstrated earlier. So let's take a look at how I set that up. So I have here box TR out, so transition out. And first of all, I have a TR out stop event, and that's stopping all of the localized positional audio that I wasn't hearing specifically in that room, so the birds chirping and stuff like that. There's not going to be any kind of hard cut when I'm leaving the space. I just want to clear those out of the memory, so I stop them with a stop event. That's just pulled straight from Wwise. And then I have this TR out tarps, so what that event is doing, we can take a quick look at that over here. So that event is stopping all of the tarp sounds, but it's giving me a 1 second fade out. And of course, if I was triggering that on trigger exit or at any point, really it doesn't matter. If I'm triggering that without being able to carry that tarp sound with me, then we're not going to hear the fade out because we're going to be leaving that positional sound behind, and it's just going to have this hard cut, rather unpleasant. So what I'm doing in addition to stopping the tarps with the fade out is I am attaching those 4 tarp sounds onto the player. And you'll see I have the 4 tarps and also the positional cello sound. So the player carries those with them. I have here an event tag that is before teleport. So I can't use on trigger exit because at that point it's already too late. We've moved away from the game object. So this is an event that triggers, I guess, milliseconds before we actually move out of the space, before the teleport triggers. And that allows me to grab all of those sound objects that I want to fade out smoothly and attach them to the player. So I have the tarp sounds, and then also on after teleport, I attach them to the audio box. That allows me to just remove them from a player. Actually, let me show that. No, I can't show it right here because they remove so fast. But when we attach an object to the player, it actually moves out of the audio scene and ends up inside the player hierarchy in the master scene. So as soon as the teleport is complete, I have here the teleport after event. I can remove those from the player and place them potentially also onto an object in the scene if I like. There are some scenes in our actual game, in Anamorphine, where we are traveling sounds over various scenes through various transitions, such as the cello. because it's obviously a key prop in our game. I can move that onto the player, add some effects to make it sound like a soundscapey 2D sound, and then I can travel that back onto the cello in a different scene, and it becomes, again, a positional sound. So in addition to that, specifically regarding the cello, I have a parameter for the cello verb, and I am toggling that parameter. It does have a slew rate attached to it in Wwise so that it's smooth. And then I'm triggering a cello stop event, which fades out the cello over a couple of seconds. So all of those things in combination create this really smooth, sweet transition. So let's look at it again now that you know how it works. And then we're in the next scene. And I'm just using a basic on-trigger enter to start the sounds of the next scene as the player enters it.
Yeah.
I guess that's the basics, yeah. Questions?
We still have.
Yeah, where are we?
Let's do this. All right. Okay.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. So while developing this tool set, obviously it started out as something like pretty tiny, and it kept growing and growing. So there's a lot of improvements that we think we can make. Hindsight's always 20/20. The biggest one, I think, is that the naming is really awkward between simple events and event tags and C# events and post events. Events manager, this is like the worst naming scheme we could have come up with. It's super confusing. Sometimes I'll be like, did you hook up this event? And we don't know if we're talking about like a C# event or the event tag
Or a Wwise event.
Or a Wwise event. It's super confusing. It was a huge mistake, and we should have changed it way earlier. Another thing is that actions and event registrars can get orphaned. There's no like hard link between sorry, there's no hard link between like an action and event. Like for instance, if you have an action that uses a tag and no other event in the game uses that tag, there's no way for us to like find out easily. Things can get kind of lost in that way. We kind of have to keep really good track of if things are useful or like if they're being triggered or not.
Something that can happen also is that an event tag will exist in the event structure. I can hook up the audio to it. Everything is great.
Yeah.
And I don't know why my things aren't working. And there's no way for me to track back where that event tag is supposed to be triggering, so I can find out potentially even who to ask or how to bug fix that to see if it's actually working or if it's actually hooked up correctly on the other end.
Yeah. So there's still, I mean, obviously the tools we're making help the team develop an engine, which is like the goal of this, but it doesn't, but it could do a little more to help like the communication within that team gel faster. And this is like one of those pain points. Registrars also could have been integrated into components. So we saw in here, when I was hooking up the art scene with the tarp, this tarp, I added this animation event registrar. I added this event registrar, and I hooked up the animation event register inside. But if I don't have this, there's no way for me to know that this has events or actions, which is another confusing thing that ended up happening. When we started building the event system, we thought, oh, it's like this little cute thing just to do like a couple hookups, and we didn't think we would be like leaning on it so hard. So when we initially built it, we didn't create like a component jar or like a property jar just for it. We instead opted for this solution. And we found that over time, especially if a component has both events and actions inside, becomes confusing or hard to know like what a component can do for us. What else we got? Some features are still kind of hacky in the audio box.
Specifically the global versus game object distance slider. The reason we mention it is that if you look at the distance slider that we have, let's go back to that scene.
Yeah.
we have here, as you may recall, we use game object references to trigger various things according to which tool we're using. But for the distance slider, we're using the game object references to reference those 2 points inside the box that are the 2 extremes of the parameter. And what that means is that in this case, if I want to use a distance slider to control a parameter, I can't make that scope game object specific. So I'm forced into a global scope for that parameter. Whereas if I'm using toggle, for example, simply by referencing game objects, the scope moves from global to game object. So little things like that. That didn't affect us too much, but you can definitely see that the tool grew according to specific use cases in some situations. We also have, I mean, if you may have noticed that we have conditions that we didn't talk about, and we also have some behaviors that we didn't talk about. And that's because there are stubs of ideas that we ended up finding better solutions for and abandoned.
Oh yeah, UI needs some cleanup. So we have this UI, like, I mean, all of it kind of needs a little spiffiness. The audio box, I mean, it's serviceable, but it's nothing fancy.
It's great. I really, I couldn't have done what I did in the game without it. It made me incredibly independent. I did probably 95% of my Unity integration myself. It allows me to work in off hours if I need to do that. And it allows me to create really elaborate structures, say overnight.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing, so we talked about the event system earlier and how everybody has to like share these events so that we can hook things up together. This looks okay here, but when you've been working on a project for a year, it's a complete mess.
Especially because a lot of different people are creating event tags in the same system.
Yeah, so like Beatrix here created a teleport before and after, but then somebody else might create inside of this apartment group, but somebody else might create a teleportations group and then an apartment subgroup inside of that, right? So just like mixing it up, and they would say, oh yeah, my tags are ready. They're ready for integration. You're like, okay, cool. And then you would look and they're not where you think they are, or things are just like slightly miscommunicated and misorganized. And this UI, I mean, we threw it up really quickly. There's no way for us to like reorder or resort without having to like delete and recreate everything, which at the end makes it feel like really crowded.
The event tag system has the potential to be really extra exciting for the sound side as well, because I can now hook up a really elaborate structure that includes a number of event tags that I require, and then I can just wait for art or code to hook up those tags on the other end, and once they have, everything just works, in theory. What ends up happening a lot is that those tags get lost, and code and art make their own tags, and then I have to go back in and set up the new tags, and that's a lot of redundant work.
Yeah, maybe like a search feature would have been really useful. Just some little things like that. On the other side, there's some quality of life improvements we would have liked or we would like to see when we were working on this project. So one of them was from the engine side, being able to query for MinMax and RTPC values. So maybe you can show like where that's set in Wwise.
Yeah, so for the non-audio people, so I have my min-max range, also my default, and those values can't get pulled by code.
Yeah, which is really frustrating because we have an interface to set min-maxes. You were just looking at something that, oh, here we are, yeah. So here we have a parameter range, and it would be nice to be able to set this maxima when the component is created, or like when the event is selected, be able to like be able to change this parameter range automatically, be able to say like this is actually your maximum and minimum, and it's not negative 500 to 500, it's actually like 0 to 100 because that's what she put in Wwise, and then from there being able to clamp down with an engine for whatever use case she might be doing. That would have been really useful. Another similar one, being able to query for current RTPC values. So it's impossible for us right now to do like a get RTPC value and send a game object and an event name.
it means that we have to be so on top of where we expect the player values to be.
Yeah.
And in our game, that's a little bit more possible because it's a fairly linear game.
Yeah.
But I think in a more open world situation, this could get really complicated because any number of things could be controlling those RTPCs, and we have no way of knowing what the current value is. We can't pull that into the audio box.
Yeah, makes it a little tough. Stopping an event is frustrating for everyone. So for me, I have to like query that event, go through, get each sound that's playing in that event, stop each individual sound. It's like kind of tedious for nothing, and for her, it's even more tedious.
Right, because so in our game, I might have several different versions of the same sound, the same original audio file, but I'm controlling it in different ways for different scenes. And so I have to create all of these custom stop events that are doing things like stopping the ambiances of scenes that we're leaving, where I have to, so for example, the stop event that I demoed here earlier. So I have to grab each one of those events individually and populate them in this stop event. And so then if I'm going back and I'm iterating, maybe I'm adding some more ambiances to those scenes, then I have to make sure they get added here, or we end up triggering events or hearing sounds where we don't want, or just using up memory unnecessarily. So yeah, it would be really great to be able to just grab an event and say, everything that's inside this event, kill it.
Yeah. And we're about the end. Oh yeah, one issue that we ran into pretty often was that since every discipline has their own scenes, sometimes something would happen on the art side where they would need to move a level over, like let's say 500 units, like in the Y direction, and now code and art has to like move as well. That's kind of annoying because everybody has to be notified and everybody has to be on the same page to move those scenes accordingly. It would have been nice to have an event system that worked only in the editor that could anchor things dynamically as things changed. That would have been something on us that we could have developed. And that's it, I think. We're open for questions. Yeah.
So one of the things was so some of the things that you already exist in the Wwise
Yes.
integration.
Yeah.
You don't have the Wwise integration. You're not using the Wwise integration and building on top of it.
So the Wwise integration does exist in the project.
Right.
None of this would work without it. But the reason that we're using the AudioBox system is because it has a lot of additional flexibility. So I can keep all of my audio content set up. So if you notice in our project, my sound scene is set up so that at the top level, I always have these boxes, and all of the functionality, I guess you could say all of the code and triggers, is set up inside these boxes. It's really clean, it's really flexible, and it compiles all of these different things into this one system. Yeah, it's very useful.
It's really consistent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, just now you were talking about stop events, and of course, in the Wwise integration, you can any play event, you can turn it into a stop event.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just do it, and
Yeah, but it's
So
not
I-
available on the API, which is like a pain point for us, right? So like as programmers, like the designer says like, oh, I need to do a stop event. I'm like, cool, and I have to look at the API, and there is no stop event. I can query the event and then stop each sound ID inside, but that's like, why am I like? I don't feel like there should be that extra step. I should just, if I can do a play event, I should be able to do a stop event, just like it is available in the like the default Wwise integration toolkit. Like I guess like when we did it, we expected the same equal functionality to be available in the API, and it's not there. Yeah.
And so the other thing is, so as a generalism, when I'm using RTPCs, I'm actually generally using a value between 0 and 1, because that's very easy for a programmer, and it doesn't make any difference to me. I don't care really, because I'm going to be adjusting the curve of however something works in Wwise on the RTPC. So then your problem of scaling would work perfectly. You just adjusting it always between 0 and 1, and then
Yeah.
it would totally go away.
Yeah. It
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean.
So there's an example, for example,
I mean,
scale
I
attenuation.
can say it would be nice. I can see why it would be nice to have but you could the workaround for me
Well,
would be
so we didn't talk about one of the tools that we have, but it's scale attenuation, and
Yeah.
it allows me to change the attenuation curve according to player position in the game, which we have to use sometimes, say, if we're moving from a small space like an apartment to a big space like the temple. And I have found that's one of the obvious limitations, because we can't use fragment numbers in the Wwise attenuation. You can't use 0.5 or 0.2 to change that. It's just whole values. And so that becomes already, that's the first obvious limitation there.
So it's not just for RTPCs. We use it in a generic sense as well. But again, I can't go and fetch what the min-maxes are. And it's more, and it's also, like, that's great that you're doing like 0 to 1s, and it's good, but it's also an assumption that that I'd be making on my side, that all of your values are going to be 0 to 1.
I mean, it's just I've just kind of gotten used. I've adapted myself to making life easier for programmers.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, everybody's basically trying to make a compromise. And I guess what I'm saying is that there's no compromise that needs to be made here. Getting the min-max should just be something that I can query. It's static. Once she puts it in, it never changes inside of the project, and like the Wwise project. So there's no reason why I shouldn't be able to query it and be able to say like, oh yeah, these are the min-maxes, and I can like display that for her on the engine side, like in the game engine side.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I saw a question back there.
Okay.
Oh, you got your
Okay.
Okay, cool.
All right. So I'm not a sound guy. I'm a programmer, and I don't
right.
use Wwise, and I don't use Unity, and I was expecting. This seems very specific.
Yeah.
So my general takeaways would be that it'd be great to have, in essence, event to a sound system, the information you're looking for. Is there more that I need to take away from that, or am I confused?
Could you repeat? I didn't hear.
All right. So, in essence, I've never used Wwise.
Yeah.
I have some background in sound, but I'm predominantly a programmer.
Mhm.
My main takeaway from this is eventing is good.
Eventing is good,
Yeah.
but also creating a generic tool set for your audio designer
Yeah.
is even better, because that's what props them up to be independent within the game engine
Mhm.
and allow them to integrate their own sounds like themselves,
Yeah.
right? Without having to go through you, without bothering you and taking up your time that could be
Yeah.
better spent doing something else.
From
No,
what I
of course. I
understand.
mean, like ideally, you're trying to create a consistent and stable interface for the other discipline to work with.
Yeah.
And in essence, make tools for them as they are required. For
Yeah.
example, if you needed to have a parameter change with location, then that's not particularly hard to create. And the thing that I also, as a suggestion, you were saying there's issues with whether or not events were hooked up and whether to put tags and so on and so forth.
Mhm.
You can just put like a verbose, a Boolean on your, I have no idea how your system is set up, but in essence, you can enable verbosity, and then every time there's an event, log it out to the screen. No
Oh yeah,
one's
we do that.
confused.
Yeah, we have that.
Yeah.
It's actually right here in the Bootstrap. So we have the event manager, and we have print events, and then you just enable that, and it'll tell
Yeah.
us like what's getting sent or not. But it's hard to know when things are not getting sent. That's the issue, or
Okay.
like in that sense. And we can also do it from the simple event the simple event or the event registrar and the action registrar. We can do it there too.
Yep.
But then it's also about like when your project has like 50 scenes, for instance, and you're going through like all the events getting
Yeah.
pushed out, like it can get overwhelming.
Well, I mean,
It's just not easy.
well,
Yeah.
then log to disk,
Yeah.
run a tool against it. It's not hard work. I mean, like
It's tedious
PowerShell.
work.
Well, no, logging to disk is not tedious, and neither
No.
is running a PowerShell against it to get a histogram. Or
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
think a
that's
big part of this is it's the process, right? Because it's not standard for the audio designer to be working in the Unity project or in the engine, period.
Mhm.
And it's not standard because of conflicts and because audio usually comes in really late. And just speaking as an audio person, I'm handcuffed at that point. I come in late, I'm heavily reliant on code to get my stuff into the game, and what I'm able to do is 10, maybe 20% of what I can do when I'm working independently in this way. And also having these independent scenes, having all of my audio in my own scene, it limits the potential of conflicts, and it means that we can all work concurrently with a minimum amount of problems.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, events are good, but like propping up your designer is better.
I
The event
understand
system
that.
is really just like a consequence of that,
Mhm.
like how to make it all work together.
Okay. Thank you.
So I'm kind of coming from the similar position as him, more programmer, definite respect for audio. I was just wondering, with your system, what could you not do with the standard Unity sound system that you can do with Wwise? And I'm not trying to put you in a position where you're like, Wwise is the best, but what if you were going to empower a sound designer,
Yeah.
use the similar tools, what does Wwise let you do that the standard audio system just couldn't do,
Well,
wanna
let's
take
take
that?
a look.
if anything?
I have a lot of, so I haven't personally used the Unity tools, but I did look into them before deciding to move into Wwise, and there's just a lot that I have control over here, especially with the game syncs and the amount of control I have in here. For example, being able to set slew rates and, well, it's just, it's a really, really powerful system. One of the things that Wwise is also really good at, we didn't get into it here, but we have this interactive music system. I only have a little bit of it here, but I can go into the music and I can set trigger points based on BPMs and time signatures. I have tons of control over transitions and how I want to move between the music stems. And this comes back into sound as well. So for states and switches, I have a lot of control over transitions, how I want to move. It's just, if you take the basic Unity audio tools and you just compound that, there's so much more depth that you can have in a system like Wwise. And Wwise isn't the only tool out there, but third-party implementation software, it just has so much more control over the nuances of how the sound moves in the space. And yeah, I mean, I really think it's worth it.
Okay, yeah, I totally get it. It's like you have a
Yeah.
badass external tool that you can do a lot of amazing
Yeah.
stuff with. Okay, there you go. I'm good.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
See, now
It's
you're
like,
gonna- now you're gonna get it, man.
if you're coming into this externally, it's like you just don't even know you don't even know that exists.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, because audio people, I'm sorry for representing everyone that is not audio person. I'm sorry for all the hell we've put you through. So, yeah, like we don't even know, so many people don't even know that kind of thing exists. Like you kind of go, you do your thing.
Yeah.
It's usually one of the first things I'll do when I come onto
Yeah.
a project is I'll do my best to sell a third-party implementation software because it
Yeah.
makes night and day.
Oh,
for me.
I've had audio people say that, and I'm like, I trust you. There is magic that you're doing. So, okay, thank you.
So with all this work you've done in Unity, and thank you, I love the idea of having all your stuff in one place rather than otherwise you're hunting in the artist's work, right? Is that kind
Yeah.
of that's the bottom line?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there something Unity could do to take some of these concepts and make it just kind of part and parcel of their build itself, so that people who don't have time to create all this?
Yeah. What can
Uh,
Unity do
yeah.
on their side?
Yeah.
They could, I think an event system would be really good, like truly support multi-scene editing on their end would be like a huge boon. So right now, there is no, and I'm not saying there should be, but there is no cross-referencing across scenes in Unity, which is fine, but there's also nothing to help it make it happen at all.
The attached to player, for example, was probably the first point where we were really like, okay, how do we do this? Because I had no easy way of transitioning out my sounds naturally when because our game is like we're teleporting the player all over the place, and it was causing problems with sound because it was just constantly sound clicking in and out, and it just wasn't nice. So we had to create this custom script attached to player just so that we had a little bit of cross-referencing where player movement is affecting audio movement,
Yeah.
even though they're in different scenes.
Yeah.
I went to I went to Unite this year, and one really interesting talk that I went to, they were talking about using scriptable objects in a way of extending the event system. So you'd have a scriptable object as essentially your tag, and then between scenes, since a scriptable object has a lifetime that is longer than, or has an infinite lifetime, let's say. So you can reference that from any scene you want, and boom, there you have your reference that that you can link between scenes. And
Is the reference done in the editor?
yes,
Okay. Like it's like like as if you're filling something in a field.
exactly.
Or you like drag and drop it in?
Exactly.
Okay.
Honestly, it was an amazing talk. It was really insightful.
Yeah.
Just to let you know,
Yeah.
I work for Audiokinetic.
Okay.
In the Unity integration.
Yeah. Okay.
So we might have to talk.
Oh,
we might
sure.
have to,
Yeah,
you know,
we got lots to say. But yeah, so if they're working on that, then that's really great. It's one of the things that we found to be like, especially with this system where like you're working on, there's a lot of scenes that happen concurrently for one like chapter of a game. That would be like a great help for us. Yeah.
Actually, yeah, sort of in addition to that, I'm loading and unloading most of my own scenes. I'm setting my
Yeah.
own load and unload triggers. And the reason for this is that because I'm traveling game objects from one scene to another, even though it's now in the player hierarchy, when the original game scene is destroyed, that sound is destroyed. And so I'm constantly requiring 3 to 5 second delays between these transitions just to let that sound ring out. And in some situations where I want that sound to play through for the next 2 or 3 scenes, those scenes have to stay alive, or I have a little master scene just for that set of scenes to carry those sounds through. So for example, there's a section in the beginning of our game where there's sort of a 3-part scene where we start in the apartment that you saw, and then we transition with the sound of the cello into sort of a dreamscape, and then the cello is right on your head, so it becomes more of a 2D sound. Other musicians join that, and then we transition from that to a concert hall, and all 4 of those game objects, it's a quartet, travel to the front of a concert hall and become positional again. So for art and code, those are separate scenes. And for audio, just because I have a lot of, say, local ambiances, I also need to have these separate scenes, so I'm not loading tons of sound at once. But then all of the sounds that I wanted to travel between those scenes are in a master scene for just that set of scenes, so that I can keep it alive.
Really cool, though, yeah.
Well, what's great is that she gets to do that implementation on her end.
Yeah, I do all of that myself.
She decides like what the best way to approach that problem, what works for her, and it doesn't require too much of my input.
Mhm. Anybody else?
All right. Thank you.
Look what time.
Yeah, on time.